What happened to those 3 women out on Highway 78 in Liberty, Kentucky? Well, that ain't just any tale. Folks still talk about it in hushed voices, still shudder when the name comes up, still avoid that stretch of road when the moon's high and the night's too quiet. Even now, after all these years, most can't rightly wrap their heads round what really happened that night. But I'll tell it to you the best I know. Maybe then you'll understand, or maybe, like the rest of us, you'll wish you hadn't. Well, howdy, y'all. Welcome to Kentucky Melody's Scary Stories from Kentucky Podcast Playlist. Here, we share spine-tingling tales and hair-raising legends straight from the heart of the bluegrass. So sit a spell, give us a thumbs up, share with your kin, and be sure to subscribe. Y'all don't want to miss a single fright now, you hear? Now, the town of Liberty, Kentucky, didn't amount to much, far as the world was concerned. It sat there quiet in the hills, wrapped up tight in its own little piece of Appalachia. Folks lived simple lives, and trouble, at least the kind you read about in the papers, rarely came creeping up them dirt roads. Houses huddled close together in the hollers, dark with sleep by the time the sky turned black. Porch lights flickered in the mist like lonely fireflies hanging too long in the cold. It was the 6th of January, 1976, a night thick with something unsettling, though no one had felt it just yet. The day had been gray, a light drizzle hanging in the air like it was too tired to come down proper. But by evening, the rain gave up, leaving the road slick and the cold starting to bite. 3 women, Mona Stafford, Louise Smith, and Elaine Thomas, were out celebrating a birthday. Nothing fancy, mind you. Mona was turning 36 years old, and a quiet supper with friends was good enough for her. Louise was the one driving that night. She was steady as they came, proud of her Chevrolet Nova, a car she kept clean as a whistle. Elaine sat in the back, quiet as ever, a woman who kept her thoughts tucked away behind a calm face. The 3 of them had eaten at Redwood's restaurant down in Stanford, about a half hour from Liberty. Redwood's was the kind of place where folks brought their families after church or grabbed a cup of coffee on their way to work. That night, the 3 women shared plates of food and laughter. Nothing heavy. No drinking, no fuss. Just a simple birthday for a simple woman. By the time they walked out into the cold January air, the town had gone dark. They climbed into Louise's Nova, the metal cold under their hands. The headlights spilled onto the quiet street, and Louise turned the key. The drive home would take them down Highway 78, a long, lonely stretch of road that cut through farmland and pressed up close against dark woods. It was a place where you could drive for miles without passing another soul. That night, as the tires hummed on the wet pavement and the stars blinked like 1,000 tired eyes, something unnatural was waiting for 'em just ahead. Mona was the first one to notice it, a strange red glow sitting low on the horizon just where the road curved round a patch of trees. At first it didn't look like much, just something strange flickering at the edge of the dark. She leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. The glow didn't move like a plane or a car, it just hung there, too still. "Look at that," Mona murmured, though her voice barely carried over the hum of the engine. The light grew brighter, spilling red across the road and trees. Louise slowed the car, her hands gripping the wheel tight as she craned her neck to see. Up ahead, the road curved, and as the car came round the bend, the women saw it. Hanging low over the road was a massive shape. It weren't no airplane, and it sure weren't no star. The thing was round, smooth as polished metal, with a glowing dome perched on top that spilled red light down like blood on snow. The craft seemed alive, breathing slow and heavy as it rocked in the air, hovering no more than 100 yards from the ground. The women fell silent. The air inside the car felt wrong, thick and heavy, like every breath took more effort. Louise's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. The engine hummed under her hands, but all around the car the woods were silent. It was too big, too quiet. Mona couldn't take her eyes off it. What is that thing? Before any of them could find the words, the craft shifted. It tilted ever so slightly to the left, like something inside was watching them. Then, from the belly of the thing, a blue light erupted, thick and blazing, like the beam of a giant searchlight. The light struck the car like a hammer, pouring through the windshield and windows, turning everything a blinding shade of blue. It felt like the light wasn't just touching them, it was inside the car, filling up the air until there wasn't room for nothing else. Louise's hands were still tight on the wheel when the Nova lurched forward. The engine roared, and the speedometer needle jumped, climbing past 85 miles an hour. Louise wasn't touching the gas. Her foot might as well have been a block of stone. The car moved on its own, pushed along by that light, the pavement flashing underneath like a roll of film, spinning too fast. Mona threw her hands up to her eyes, the burning feeling starting to claw at her skin. Elaine was frozen in the back seat, her mouth open, but no sound came out. The light was hot and cold all at once. It didn't make sense, and the harder they tried to move, the more they realized they couldn't. It was like their bodies were glued to their seats, helpless and small under the weight of something bigger than them. The road disappeared, the trees turned into a blur of light and dark, and then there was nothing, just blackness. When the women came to, the Nova was sitting still. The engine purred soft and quiet, like it had never been pushed harder than a country road at 35. The headlights were on, spilling white light onto a patch of dirt and grass. Louise blinked and sat up, her hands still locked around the wheel. Mona rubbed her eyes, blinking back tears from the burning that hadn't gone away. "Where are we?" Elaine's voice cracked, sounding small and hollow. They looked out the windows and saw something strange. They were sitting just outside of Houstonville, almost 8 miles from where they'd been. But none of them could remember driving there. Louise looked down at the dash. Her hands shook as she turned off the ignition, and the hum of the engine died into silence. They didn't speak much on the drive back to Liberty. The burn on Mona's neck itched, and every blink brought back the light, the thick blue light that felt like it had crawled into her skin. When Louise parked her car in her driveway, her pet parakeet, normally a quiet, sweet little thing, threw itself around its cage like it was trying to get out. It screamed and flapped its wings as though it knew something unnatural had followed Louise home. The women sat in the quiet house, staring at one another. None of them slept that night. Something had happened to them out there on Highway 78, but what, they couldn't say. Morning broke gray and pale over Liberty, Kentucky. The hills still held onto winter's chill, and frost clung stubborn to the tall grass. There weren't much talk about the strange lights in the sky just yet, but over in Louise Smith's little house, something wasn't right. Louise sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped tight around a cup of coffee, though the coffee had long gone cold. She hadn't slept a wink. Neither had Mona Stafford or Elaine Thomas, who'd spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, flinching every time the wind rattled the windows. When Louise looked down at her hands, she noticed something. Her skin itched like it had been burned, and her neck, just below her hairline, was red and sore. She didn't want to touch it, but the spot throbbed like a fresh welt. The car, her shiny Nova, sat parked outside looking fine at first glance, but when Louise went to check on it later that morning, something was off. The car had developed strange electrical problems, the kind that couldn't be blamed on the battery or the cold. The headlights flickered when she turned the key, the dashboard lights blinked like they had a mind of their own, and the ignition made a whining sound it never had before. What hit her hardest, though, was her little parakeet. That bird, which had been the cheeriest thing in her house, wouldn't stop screeching when she walked past the cage. It flapped its wings, throwing itself against the bars until Louise finally had to cover the cage with a quilt just to quiet it down. Something unnatural had settled into her home, and Louise could feel it in the air. Over at Mona's, things weren't much better. She kept running her hands over her neck, feeling the raw skin where the burning had started. Her eyes stung, and every time she closed them, she saw that light, that awful blue light, burned into the back of her mind like it had left scars there too. Elaine sat quiet, refusing to speak of what happened. She looked haunted, like she'd seen something her soul couldn't scrub clean. Word travels fast in small towns, and it didn't take long for the story to spread. Folks whispered about UFOs and strange lights, shaking their heads and wondering if the three women had seen something out of this world or just gone plumb crazy. But whatever folks believed, the women's faces told the truth. They were rattled to their very bones. That's when investigators come knocking. The women's story made its way to the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, which was a group that studied strange lights, flying saucers, and stories just like the one coming out of Liberty. A couple of the investigators drove down from out of state, their cars bumping along Liberty's back roads, their suitcases stuffed full of cameras, notebooks, and recorders. They sat the women down one by one, Mona, Louise, and Elaine, and they asked questions. "Tell us what you saw that night," they said. Now, most folks, when they're making up a story, they can't keep their details straight. But not these women. They told the same tale over and over, never losing a beat. The investigators separated them, trying to poke holes in the story, but the women didn't waver. They talked about the light, the car speeding out of control, the burning sensation on their necks and eyes. They even described the craft, the metallic disc, silent and hovering, like they were all seeing it again right there in front of them. The MUFON folks scratched their heads. Something had happened out there, and whatever it wasn't no prank or case of nerves. The women were telling the truth. That's when they called in Dr. R. Leo Sprinkle, a psychologist and UFO researcher who'd spent years listening to folks claiming they'd been taken out of their cars, out of their beds, out of their lives, by things not of this world. Dr. Sprinkle didn't come with ridicule or disbelief. He came with calm eyes and a voice like a teacher, and he told the women he could help them remember. Dr. Sprinkle had something he called hypnotic regression, a way to pull at memories that folks couldn't reach on their own, like tugging at a loose thread until the whole thing unraveled. It weren't no parlor trick, neither. Under hypnosis, people tended to remember things clear as day, sometimes things they didn't even know they'd forgotten. One by one, he put the women under, and what come out of their mouths would chill a person to their core. First was Louise, sitting stiff-backed in a chair as Dr. Sprinkle's voice carried her back to that night. Under hypnosis, her face twisted as she started talking, not to him, but like she was back in the car, back in that awful blue light. "It's pulling us," she whispered, her hands clenching at her sides. "We can't move. I can't move." Then Mona, whose voice trembled as she spoke of the sensation of floating, like she was being pulled out of the car, up and up into the cold. She remembered metal walls, blazing lights, and strange sounds humming like a hive of bees. And what they saw inside. It was small creatures, she said, spindly arms and big black eyes that stared right through her, the kind of eyes that don't blink, don't feel nothing. She remembered lying on something cold, cold as a slab at the morgue, and feeling something burning against her skin, like a beam of light was cutting through her without leaving a mark. Elaine, the quietest of the three, wept as she talked. She didn't want to go back to it, but the memories were there, clawed into her mind like wounds that never healed. She spoke of hearing the low hum of machines, of shadows moving all around her, of a voice she couldn't understand whispering inside her head. By the time Dr. Sprinkle finished, the women were pale, spent, and shaken. Their stories matched down to the last detail, and their faces said more than words ever could. They'd seen something that no person ought to see. The story spread from Liberty like ripples in a pond. Newspapers ran articles, people came to see the women, and skeptics tried to pick their story apart. But no matter how hard they tried, the details held. The lie detector tests they took, they passed. The car's electrical problems, unexplained, and those burns on their necks, folks didn't know what to make of them. The Liberty alien abduction remains one of the most chilling and credible accounts of its kind, even after all these years. Some folks say it was something not of this earth. Others reckon it was something worse, a nightmare planted in the minds of three women who just wanted to get home safe that night. And maybe that's the scariest part. Because whatever came down out of the sky on January 6th, 1976, it didn't leave no footprints, no fingerprints, no explanation. Just three women who stared into the dark and came back changed. So, if you ever find yourself out on Highway 78 and the night grows still and a light appears out of nowhere, don't stop. Keep your eyes on the road and your hands steady on the wheel. You don't want to know what's waiting for you out there. Now, before we wrap this up, we want to hear from y'all. What do you think about the story? Do you reckon there's more to it? Or maybe you've got your own theory about what happened. If you've got thoughts, or even a spooky tale of your own, drop us a comment or message. We're all ears, and who knows, your story might just end up on the next episode. So, let us know what you're thinking. Thanks for listening to Kentucky Melody's Scary Stories from Kentucky Podcast Playlist. If tonight's story sent a shiver down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you're ready for the next tale. It's coming soon, and it might just be the scariest yet. Keep your eyes peeled and your doors locked, though. Sometimes the stories have a way of finding you first. See you next time, if you're still around.